My name is Kevin Chisholm. I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador here at the college. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. And I'd also like to acknowledge tonight's event is also being broadcast via Zoom. The Institute's mission here is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I'd just like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or other devices that may make any sort of noise. Tonight's speaker is David M. Drucker. He is the senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, focusing on Congress, campaigns, and national political trends. He is a Vanity Fair contributing writer and appears regularly on cable news and nationally syndicated radio programs. A native of Los Angeles, Mr. Drucker resides on Capitol Hill with his wife and two sons. And he joins us tonight's NHIOP Bookmark series to discuss his new book, In Trump's Shadow, The Battle for 2024 and the Future of the GOP, telling the story of a GOP under and after the 45th President of the United States. Following Mr. Drucker's remarks, we'll have a brief question and answer period. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. David Drucker.
So, it's interesting. Normally, I would criticize somebody like me who decides to write a book about 2024, even before the 2020 election. But the way our politics has unfolded over the past 10 years or so, especially in states like New Hampshire, but not even in not even in New Hampshire, there's really no off year. And for those of us that are either political reporters or political operatives, we use this term, the off year, meaning it's the odd year when there are only elections in Virginia and Kentucky, and I'm leaving one out and they don't count, so who cares? Except Virginia, I know counts. That'll be on Tuesday next week, and that could be very big. But really, there's been no off year anymore. And part of the reason for that is that candidates don't take time off. Potential candidates are always preparing for the next race, in part because they're competitive, they're ambitious, and they want to get ahead. And so they have come to use the off year to do all of the things that they used to wait until the October right before the on year. I'm old enough to remember, I think Bill Clinton announced for president in October of 91. And if we were to translate into today's political calendar, he would have announced for the 92 race in October of 89. So the original idea for the book really came about because in 2019, I had written a couple of stories about Republicans, some prominent Republicans that were already preparing for the 2024 campaign. Now, mind you, President Trump had not yet run for re-election, and they were already preparing for a race that was 5 years away. And the more I looked into it, they had been preparing for that race, in some cases since before Trump was elected president. But after he assumed office, those efforts really accelerated. And I thought, wouldn't that be an interesting book? Or at least wouldn't my agent not tell me it was a lousy idea if I were to write something about this shadow campaign going on even before Trump had won or lost. And lucky enough for me, my agent actually finally liked the idea. And I joke about that because, excuse me, I had pitched him about 7 or 8 ideas. First, he encourages me to write a book. Then he proceeds to tell me all of my ideas aren't worthy of a book. And so I pitched this idea. I didn't hear from him for 10 days. And then I said, well, he probably doesn't like this one, but I'll send him one follow-up email. And I sent it, and he actually liked this one. So the idea for the book started from there. And the one thing I'll say is I feel justified, not only because I knew what I was seeing, but because from the moment President Trump left the White House after losing re-election, Republicans started showing up in Iowa and New Hampshire as though it were 2023. I mean, I've never seen the early primary states as busy so soon. And not only are they busy with candidates, granted they're helping people running in 2022, but we all know why they're here, but there's a market for them. Like voters and activists are turning out to see them. And so the turnstile at the airport just keeps getting busier. The other thing I decided to do with the book as we sort of develop the thematics of the book is to talk about Trump's impact on the party. We thought that would be an interesting sort of way to thread the shadow campaign together. And I walked away from reporting the book with sort of two big themes that I think are bearing themselves out as we speak. One is that I think that Donald Trump represented a generational break with the Reagan era. Now, I'm old enough to remember the Reagan era. I'm a child of the Cold War, which makes me sound older than I feel when you talk like that. But I realize that not everybody today remembers that because they weren't alive. For most of my life, beginning in 1980 through 2016, every 4 years, there was either a Reagan on the ballot or after he was done running, there was a collection of Republicans all competing to be the next Reagan, all swearing up and down to Republican voters that if you elect me, you're going to get Reagan. I'm the real Reagan. He's not the real Reagan. He's a pretender Reagan. I'm the real Reagan. I don't think we're going to see that in 2024. In fact, I'm almost positive we're not going to see that in 2024. What you're going to see is a collection of candidates, particularly if Trump doesn't run because the field will be larger, but they're all going to say in some way or another that they will be the next Trump, that they are the heir to Trump's legacy, that they will perpetuate the Trump agenda, and some of them will say that they will perpetuate the Trump attitude. Now, some of these candidates will be very subtle about this. They'll tell you that I'm going to give you the best of Trump without the worst of Trump. And others will say, well, there is no worst of Trump, so you're going to get the best of Trump with the best of Trump. And that is a change, right? And that is, and that doesn't mean that there won't be an outlier or two, but I always say the exception proves the rule. This is going to be something that is completely different. And in part, it's because aside from the president's at times controversial or provocative behavior, Republicans feel confident that his agenda was very well received. And you just look at the down ballot results in 2020. And if you're a Republican, you say to yourself, well, even though President Trump lost, we gained 14 House seats, came close to winning back the majority. Nobody thought we could. You probably discount the loss of the Georgia Senate seats because Trump had a lot to do with that. You look at the fact that you didn't lose control of any state legislature heading into a redistricting season, not any legislature that you had control of. And you say to yourself, the problem with Trump was Trump, but his trade policies, a lot of his foreign policies, national security policies, his domestic tax and regulatory policy, even his immigration policy. And I say even because if you look at border counties in Texas, Trump actually flipped at least one of them that hadn't voted for a Republican for president in 100 years, a majority Hispanic county along the border in Texas. So his numbers with non-white voters went up. And so you're a Republican, you don't want to jettison the Trump agenda. You don't want to rebrand or go backward. What you want to do is take the best of Trump, but try and expand your audience and do better with independents and do better with soft Democrats. So that's another reason why I feel like we have had a break with sort of not all of Reagan republicanism, and especially on the foreign policy and national security front. You're going to see probably more than one candidate try and combine a Reagan-style foreign policy, at least in rhetoric, with a Trump-style domestic policy. The other big thing I learned from the book, and this was really interesting to me, when I started asking questions of Republican strategists who work campaigns and aren't retired, And I started saying, well, look, what are the issues that are going to matter most to Republican primary voters in the next campaign, the next presidential campaign? They all tended to agree that attitude was the most important, that you had to project the way Trump did, that you're a fighter. And specifically, they would all use that word, that you needed to be a fighter, that Republican primary voters aren't interested in statesmen, and they aren't interested in people that only punch up. They want somebody that punches in all directions. You know, often Donald Trump will get mad at some dopey reporter like me or some person out in the country that nobody has ever heard of who tweeted something mean about him. And he'll respond and everybody will say, why the heck are you punching down? Especially once he was president. I mean, you're the president of the United States. Why are you punching down? But, you know, to a lot of Republican voters, what that meant was he was willing to fight anyone, anywhere, for any reason. And they like that. And so the challenge for the Republicans that run after him or even against him is, how do you communicate that in your own authentic way? Because you're not Donald Trump, and they're not going to let you act like Trump because it's going to seem like it's contrived. But you're already seeing a lot of this happen in Senate primaries, in particular across the country heading into 2022. You can check out the Ohio Senate primary, the North Carolina Senate primary, the Arizona Senate primary. It's a competition, in a sense, to tell voters that I may not be Trump, but I'm the next best thing. And so I think that this really shapes the future of the party. It could shape the long-term future of the party. It could shape just the next election. But this is the through line running through all of these different candidates. I picked a number of different candidates to focus on. They all had one thing in common, besides the fact that if I wrote about all of them, I would have been writing my book until 2032 and missed the whole point of the 24 race. If they hadn't started planning for a White House bid before Trump ran for re-election, I didn't focus too heavily on them. So that made it one easy way to create a cutoff. But I did also spend a lot of time focusing on Trump and his family. And I sat down with him in Mar-a-Lago and I just tried to get inside of his head and find out what he thought. The interesting thing about Trump is he's always saying things that are so out there, so different, so provocative, sometimes, you know, so maddening and controversial that it's hard to really know why he does what he does or what he was actually thinking. So I thought, given that there are so many great books, and I mean that are digging into the Trump presidency and teaching us about all of the things we didn't know were happening, what if I tried to focus on the future and what's next by finding out what makes him tick? And also by finding out what makes all of these other candidates that are already spending a lot of time up here, what makes them tick. And, you know, at one point, it's one of my favorite anecdotes just because it's so revealing. I don't know if you guys saw the news recently, you know, Trump said, if you don't start focusing more on 2020, then Republicans aren't going to show up in 22 and 24. And which would be interesting if he was on the ballot 24, because I think they might show up for him. But he said that, and it reminded me when I sat down with him in May, I said, you know, do you think you hurt your party's case in Georgia? I said, what would have happened in Georgia if you would have told Georgia Republicans, look, I know we're upset about the way the election turned out, and we think there are a lot of problems with Georgia's voting systems and the rules, and these all need to be fixed and reformed, and we're going to do that. But you can trust the system, go vote. These Senate seats are important. We can't lose the Senate majority. And he tells me, you know, I did two rallies. I did 2 rallies in Georgia, very successful rallies. But I suppose I didn't say it as strongly as you say. But people were angry. They were mad about the 2020 election. And then he proceeds to tell me, all these Republicans keep talking about 22 and 24. That's where we need to focus. And he said, that's not where we need to focus. We need to focus on 2020. And I said, well, couldn't that cost you seats in 2022 or hurt your case for winning the majority or even the presidency the next time around? He said, well, maybe, but people are angry. And then he was quick to add, well, look, it could also be an asset, because he basically was saying, if you focus on 20, they'll be pleased, and therefore they will put their energy into 22 and 24. But the point here being, he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly what he did. He understands the power he has over Republican voters. He was telling me, he described Mar-a-Lago as the grand central station of Republican politics. He said, I see more Republicans now than when I was in Washington. They all want my endorsement. In fact, just before I met with him, he was talking to Mark Walker, who was there to try and get Trump's endorsement, running for Senate in North Carolina, didn't get Trump's endorsement. But he's acutely aware that he has influence in the party, and he enjoys using it. There's this great anecdote about the National Republican Senatorial Committee, which I believe has a direct hotline into Governor Sununu's office these days. They, at the beginning of the 2020 cycle, they wanted to go meet with Trump's reelection campaign because they thought, look, our Senate races are dependent on him. Any way we can be helpful. We want to know where they're coming from. We should all just get to know each other. So they get in the car and they go across the Potomac River to Trump reelection headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. And they sit down with Brad Parscale, who was the campaign manager at the time, and a bunch of other top muckety mucks of the Trump campaign. And it's the top staff at the NRSC, and it's the Trump campaign. And they're kind of chit-chatting. And out of nowhere, Parscale says, look, whatever you guys do, and the top staff at the NRSC is like bracing for some strategic, like, we need you to do this, or you want to talk about this. Whatever you do, don't use the president's image or likeness without our permission. And they were kind of like, what are you talking about? Like, he's the president of the United States. He's the leader of the party. I mean, of course, we're not going to put words in his mouth in a fundraising email appeal. We're not going to put quotes around anything as though he said it without permission. But like, Republican voters love Trump, and he's the top of the ticket, and we're going to use his face everywhere. And it just dumbfounded them. But so I asked Trump about that because I knew I was going to use the anecdote in the book. And I was actually just really curious about it. I said, why do you want permission for your own party to use your image and likeness? And he said, because I don't like all Republicans. I don't think all those groups do a really good job. So I wanted permission. He is openly hostile to his own party to this day. But guess what? For a lot of Republican voters, he shares their contempt for their own party, the party they affiliate with. So they like it. They don't like Republicans in Washington any more than he does. And it was kind of funny as a reporter, once he was president, he would beat up on the government as though he was still like some random voter out in the Midwest. I'd be like, dude, you run the place, like, fix it. But the point politically is that for Republican voters in particular, but even, let's say, just unaffiliated voters that are constantly upset with Washington, the fact that he kept that up in some ways was a political strength. Now, look, ultimately, he ended up having his problems politically with how he handled COVID, because, he was supposed to be in charge of a major thing, and that was a problem. But the sort of things that people would often think was a vulnerability in some ways was a strength, because to a lot of voters, it was always a signal that he understood them and hadn't gone Washington. Now, there's a flip side to that, which is if you don't like his antics and you don't like his policy, but you're open to supporting him or just open to not being angry at him, the fact that you're the president and constantly complaining that the government's no good, leads you to believe that, well, then why are you there if you're not the one that's going to fix it since we elected you? So there's a plus and minus to this thing. But, the bottom line is people, I think, often wonder if Trump knows what he's doing or if he's aware of the problems he causes Republicans. And he is. And he's just fine with that. And he enjoys the leverage he has with them. And he enjoys watching them scurry down to Mar-a-Lago to make peace with him. And they keep coming up with ways to make peace with him. The NRSC invented this award, the Champion of Freedom Award, with this glass bowl, and they went down and they presented it to Trump, made a big deal out of it. Meanwhile, he still interjects into Senate races when he wants to, and there's just no way to buy him off in that regard. For him to lose power, his relationship with the voters would have to diminish, or he'd have to actually just retire and stop talking. That's not going to happen anytime soon. The last thing I'll leave you guys with before I take questions, I'm happy to take as many questions as you like, is, and I get this question a lot, well, is he going to run? Right? And, to talk to Trump for as long as I did, and some people talk to him even longer over many sessions, but to talk to him as long as I did, you get this recitation of his enemies list. So I would ask him some random question about, I don't know, you gave a speech once and what did it mean to you? And he'd say, well, Liz Cheney's a psycho. And Pat Toomey's stupid. And Mitch McConnell has nothing going. There's this whole, I tried to capture it all. But then out of nowhere, he says, well, how come everybody thinks I'm not running? Well, I don't know. Why does everybody think I'm not running? So I said, Mr. President, are you running? Make some news. This will be great. I'll save it for the book. Nobody will know until October, because I'm sure you wouldn't give it away. And he said, well, I haven't decided whether to run or not. And then we went off the record. And basically, what he does with everybody is he tells them essentially that he plans to run. But the truth is, he would never tell me one way or the other, because I don't think he's decided. I think he wants everybody to think he wants to run because it adds to the power he has inside the party. I don't think he even knows what he's going to do. And I think he won't really know for sure until, well, either he blurts it out and ruins my talk, or we get past the 2022 elections and he starts to think, okay, the beginning of the presidential cycle has started. Am I doing this? Do I want to jump in now? Do I want to jump in late? He loves the rally. But as people connected to Trump told me, and when I asked this question, he may end up finding out that the trappings of the ex-presidency, especially being feted the way he is, are more appealing than the trappings of the actual presidency. Where once you get past all of the rallies and the campaigning, which he absolutely loves, is real work. And it's not that I'm not suggesting he doesn't want to work. All I'm suggesting is the presidency is a job like no other. He's done it. He has accomplished a lot. And he may just decide, why do I want to be bothered, especially when I still am so relevant. And of course, all of this is predicated on things rolling out the way, I think. Over the summer, when Biden started to implode because of the Afghanistan fiasco, the current president's numbers were so weak, I started to worry that Trump would ruin my book and jump in at any minute. And I actually called one of his people. I said, I know he doesn't want to jump in early for various reasons having to do, at the very least, with filing fundraising and financial disclosures with the Federal Election Commission. Has his mind changed? And my source said, no, his mind hasn't changed as far as I know. So this is, covering politics in the age of Trump. At least I made it to my book publishing date. I'd be happy to answer questions about the people I covered. Anything I said, I'm all yours. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that the Republican voters, Trump's language and his punching down, as you said, is a strength because it shows that he's a fighter. Many voters in New Hampshire, he lost percentage points up here. I think that kind of language turns away a large chunk of the independent voters and more soft Democrats, as you said, and loses states or more moderate conservatives in that way, who are more reminiscent of that Reagan era. Do you see him or candidates like Trump or trying to be that Trumpian in the 2024 cycle tone down the rhetoric or embrace it fully? And do you see that as a detriment or as a positive for their success?
Yeah, so your analysis is 100% correct. As one of my editors told me recently, Trump reminds him of Brett Favre. He could play you into the game and he could play you right out of the game. Trump's strengths with Republican voters are clear problems with independent voters, soft Democrats, people that are not necessarily that political. You know, the upside of Trump is all anybody ever talks about is Trump. The downside for Trump is half those people don't like him. He activated so many Republican voters. He earned more votes in 2020 than any incumbent president in history. The downside is Joe Biden got more votes. So I think what you're going to see from Republicans who run for president in 24 is a collection, and some because they'll want to win that primary, and maybe because they just believe that Trump politically worked, warts and all, will be as Trumpy as he was, or in their own way with the rhetoric and the combativeness. But Republicans, many Republicans are very well aware of the downsides. So you will see them try and offer the Trump agenda and promise voters that they'll fight, but not do it with the same coarse, provocative rhetoric, not punch down, not say things that become a news story in and of themselves. They'll try and take the best of what he had to offer Republicans and dispense with the worst of it. But some will do that. In fact, one place you can follow this right now, if you just want to see sort of the, it's like kind of like AAA in baseball, right? In particular, if you pay attention to the Ohio Senate primary, there are about 6 Republicans running. You have Josh Mandel, who is basically imitating Trump. You have J.D. Vance, who is offering a very populist or conservative populist agenda with some of the language, but with a little bit more refinement than Josh Mandel. And then over on the other side, you have Matt Dolan, a state senator whose family owns the Cleveland, I guess it's going to be the Cleveland Guardians, but the Cleveland Indians, who is going out of his way to tell everybody he would have certified the election and that we need to get something done versus just have a catharsis. And so there you're seeing Republicans run the gamut. And then in the middle, you have people saying how much they love Trump and support Trump and will do more of Trump, but they're not doing it with the same sort of rhetoric that can cause a backlash among independents, among women, among suburban Republicans. So it's a mixture. The other way I can answer your question too is there's one area where Trump hasn't fully captured the party, and that's on foreign policy. You know, I read extensively about Tom Cotton, who on domestic issues is actually in some ways a Trump before Trump, if you look at some of his positions. But on national security policy, he's still very much in the Reagan mold and even in the Bush mold in believing in projecting American power abroad, including American military power, where you'll hear a lot of Republicans say, well, we need to do something about China, or we need to do something about the Middle East, but we shouldn't send our military anywhere. You know, Tom Cotton's willing to say, no, we should send our military if we need to send them, and we should project American power. Yeah.
I see Trump's a lot like what Hillary Clinton holding the party in suspense. What Hillary did after Obama's election first, everybody knew she was going to win. The party was in suspense. There were no leaders that came up. And as it turned out, 316, the only one who challenged her was not a Democrat. It was Bernie. Is anybody in the Republican Party bold enough now to say, I'm running, who the hell cares? Is anybody going to go out there and say, I've got a new idea and maybe bring a little civility to the conversation? Or is that past?
Really good question. So, and in fact, it's kind of the way I answer this question is to point out that as we approach 24, there are some Republicans that whether they have been waiting or whether they're sort of new entrants are of a certain age that maybe they don't want to wait around, regardless of what Trump does. Right. So if you're, you know, you're Mike Pence, and I think he's in his 60s now, if I've got this right. If you're Rick Scott, Senator of Florida, NRSC chairman, you're in your 60s. You're Mike Pompeo, you're in your late 50s. You may not want to wait around. And what have you got to lose? So I think there are Republicans that are not going to wait to see what Trump does, and in fact may run even if Trump runs. And they can always make the calculation that, oh, it's not working. I don't have enough support. I can't raise enough money. I don't think, and that's why I get into little debates with people. I don't think Trump is going to automatically clear the field. And I'll get the second part of your question in a minute. I interviewed Pompeo recently for my podcast, which is a companion to the book, also called In Trump's Shadow. And I said, if Trump runs, does it mean you won't? It's an interesting question because he was Trump's Secretary of State, CIA director. He worked for Trump, and often there's this unwritten rule, you don't run against the political figure that made you, so to speak. But Pompeo wouldn't say that. All he said was, if you believe that you should be president, that you have something to offer at that level, you can't stand down for anybody, or nobody is going to believe in you, and it means you're not right for the job anyway. I've got signals from Mike Pence's camp that he's not going to stand down automatically. Whether or not anybody can beat Trump is a different story, but the attitude is important. They're not all looking to stand down. Some of them, maybe a lot of them, will make political calculations to stand down, but I think given where they are in their careers, their age, not everybody runs when they're 78 years old. I think some of them will run, even if Trump runs, because what have they got to lose? And it may elevate their stature for a vice presidential pick or a cabinet post. The civility issue is an interesting question. Politicians ultimately are salesmen in that they want positive reinforcement from voters. They will give voters anything they think voters want beyond, look, if somebody's pro-life or if somebody believes in passionately in choice on abortion, they're not going to change their stripes, right? I mean, that's a deeply felt issue. But, if you're a Republican and you're all basically in agreement on tax policy, then it's about who's a better leader. It's about personality connection. There's not a lot of incentive right now for civility, particularly in the ways in which you raise money and gain media attention. The way you raise money online and the way you leverage social media platforms to raise money and gain attention is to be kind of outrageous and to be kind of angry and to be kind of shrill, and so you project that to raise small dollars from grassroots supporters all over the country. Online fundraising now has become just as important as fundraising from wealthy donors and bundlers. And in fact, by the time we get to 2028, we'll have probably surpassed individual donors in importance. We're going to get to a point where you could dispense of the big donors entirely. And I mean, it'll never happen, generally speaking, but you could almost do it. So it's about incentives. If the country decides it wants more civility, if the country decides it wants people to stop acting like jackasses, then the country will get that. But right now the incentives are, and I see this covering the right and the left, is for, if not extreme voices, extreme rhetoric. And we see this even just on a basic level. Every politician runs around and tells you like that this election is not only the most important election in our lifetimes, the country is over as we know it if it doesn't go our way, which is really interesting because we have elections every 2 years. And if the country is in such dire straits that one 4-year term of one president is going to make or break, I mean, there's always another election, and politics isn't static, but people, because I think what the country's been through over the past 20 years, and because there's so much insecurity out there, we just went through a pandemic on top of it all, people have lost a lot of trust in institutions. And so it's hard to run as an 80s or 90s style candidate when people, so many voters have lost trust in so-called elites, people that have been in government, when they think that the government hasn't done such a good job. Yeah.
Isn't that exactly the reason that they voted for Trump?
Yep.
Because he was presenting himself as outside of the government.
Yes.
That he was not a Republican per se, but that he was conservative.
Well,
He made a distinction that a lot of people in this country were hoping to follow.
well, what I would say is this. I mean, you're on point, first of all. I think you recognize some of his appeal. I like to describe Trump as this. When Trump was running in 2016, and people said, he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't have any experience. I think a lot of voters said, well, I've been voting for the experienced people who know what they're doing my entire life. And where's that gotten me? We had a war that didn't go quite right. We had the Great Recession. Everything's a mess. So you're telling me to vote for the people that know what they're doing, and that hasn't worked. I would say, and I'm quoting now Trump back to you, he was once accused in an interview, I don't mean accused, he was once challenged. Well, this position you have isn't very conservative. He said, well, I'm not running to lead the conservative party. I'm running to lead the Republican Party. So he ended up governing rather conservative. But I will tell you, even people that worked for him told me that they never quite knew what they were going to get, that they hoped he would govern as conservative as he did, but that they recognized his general appeal, and that's why they supported him, worked for him. But they were actually pleasantly surprised. These are like a lifetime Republicans, conservatives who worked on his first campaign, went to work for him in the administration. They had no idea he would be that conservative on the key issues. It just turns out that he was, but they were personally pleasantly surprised.
I think was the impact of January 6th on the political environment.
So really good question. And it's a hard question to answer because both parties reverted to form. So, I watched January 6th happen, and you think maybe this is sort of seminal event that is either going to alter the trajectory of particular politicians or parties or change how people behave. The two sort of top line results of January 6th were, one, Donald Trump was as popular as ever inside the Republican Party, at least when it came to his relationship with voters. But also, if you look at how the Democrats reacted, I'm not saying this to be critical, but let's say you look at January 6th as this horrific event that needs to be addressed. You could make an argument that both sides should start doing at least in Washington, might start at least temporarily doing politics differently. In some ways, you could look at it like the pandemic. So we had a 100-year, once in a 100-year pandemic. And the first thing Democrats and Republicans and President Trump did that they could never do almost ever was get together on a bipartisan basis and approve, $5 trillion in spending on all sorts of things. Now, you could agree or disagree with the idea that we should spend the money, but like that thing was a crisis, and they all got together and started passing bills. Now, it ended up sort of breaking down over the first summer, and it took them a long time to pass that final bill under Trump. But the first thing they did was like something you generally hadn't seen. And Republicans agreed to spend boatloads of money, and a Democratic House agreed to, let Trump so-called have a victory. So they all function differently in relationship to a crisis. Coming out of January 6th, Republicans on Capitol Hill act like it never happened, don't want to talk about it. And Democrats on Capitol Hill, well, they're more than happy to talk about it, and who can blame them? But if you look at President Biden's agenda that he's trying to get through the Congress right now, it's a very liberal agenda that is only going to pass with Democratic votes. And the one bipartisan thing he did, the one unifying bill that he was able to negotiate, has been stuck in limbo because Democrats in the House and the Senate, for that matter, are refusing to allow it to pass ultimately unless this reconciliation package passes. So if everybody had reacted to January 6th and freaked out and said, oh my God, we have a problem in this country, we need to do things differently, we need to come together or at least not be at each other's throats, then you might take a look at a 50-50 Senate and a 5-seat majority House and a presidential election that was clearly decided, but was very narrow within the states that made a difference, and say, let's maybe govern left of center and not left. When you get that bipartisan infrastructure bill, that, by the way, Trump could never get done, you pass it right away and you say, look what we've been able to do together. Now we're going to start spending money on infrastructure. And then you negotiate a big spending package and you tell Republicans, look, we're in the majority, so you're not going to like it all. And if you want to say no, fine, but we're going to do something that's center left, not left. But everybody's reverted to form. And then if you're Republicans, you'd say, this was a really bad thing. We're going to participate in the January 6th Special Select Committee. We're going to approve the creation of a bicameral committee in the Senate and not vote it down. Or at least in the House, Republicans are going to appoint serious people to the committee and not give Pelosi any reason to object. But everybody's acting as though politics is just like it always has been, that there's no crisis at all. So it's like, so great question. The initial response to January 6th in terms of how it's going to impact our politics is it hasn't impacted our politics at all. Everybody's behaving just like they always did. Nobody's acting like they think anything bad almost happened. Nobody. And it's actually kind of interesting. I focus on what certain Republicans did in relation to January 6th and in Trump's shadow, but this is a larger question. And the truth is, everybody's acting like it's business as usual. Nothing happened, nothing to see here. It's not how they talk per se, but those are what their actions signify.
I think they're concerned about this happening again.
Well, Democrats are, and some Republicans are, but it's hard to tell because when you're really concerned about something happening again, you see that through action. And I'm not saying that people are being purposely disingenuous. It's just a very weird dichotomy to me. Like, I think Republicans should be a lot more concerned about it happening again. Democrats are, but I think if Democrats are as concerned as they say they are, and I believe they are, but then how come they didn't approach some things differently? I mean, Republicans, I could talk all day long about their faults, but even Democrats, for all of their concern, are practicing politics as usual. So everybody's practicing politics as usual, is my point.
We have a couple of questions came into the Zoom.
Yeah.
The first one is, as Trump sort of figures out this sort of kingmaker position he's in, what do you see as the future political career of his family members? And then the second one, whether it's in 2024 or afterwards, who would you think is the sort of heir apparent of Donald Trump?
So the most likely heir apparent is Donald Trump Jr. because he wants to be in the political game. He enjoys it. He has been establishing relationships across the party. He, of all of Trump's kids, has been the most helpful to Republicans not named Trump. As a fundraiser, as a headliner, he, I'll talk to Republicans and they'll give me myriad complaints about former President Trump, but they have nothing but nice things to say about Donald Trump Jr. Whenever we ask for something, he answers. Whatever he does for us, he works really hard at doing it. He never mails it in. I write this in Trump's shadow. Donald Trump Jr., every time he helps another Republican raise money or a Republican committee raise money, signs data sharing agreements. So he's been collecting thousands and thousands and thousands or millions of emails and contacts that he could put to use himself in a future campaign. He's not going to run in 2024. He's got young kids. He has to put them all through school. God knows what his divorce cost him. But here's somebody who wants to be influential and wants a life in politics. I don't know if he wants a career in politics. He wants a life in politics. When I interviewed Donald Trump, all he wanted to do was talk about Ivanka, which is probably no surprise to anybody. And I kept trying to get him back to Donald Trump Jr. and he kept going back to Ivanka. And I'd try again, back again. She could run for anything. I wanted to make her UN ambassador. She'd be amazing. Finally, I don't know if it's a fathers and sons thing. I've got 2 boys. Finally, I get him. He's like, yes, Donald Trump Jr. would be good. If he moved somewhere, he could get elected. I would help him. The interesting thing to me about Trump Jr. is, again, he has become almost like his father's emissary to the Republican establishment. You know, members of the establishment that either privately don't like Trump or just aren't Trumpy people, they all like Donald Trump Jr. In fact, so when I told you guys earlier about Trump's enemies list that he kept making sure I knew about, he tells me, you know, Dean Heller, and I don't know if you guys remember Dean Heller, he was a senator from Nevada. He lost re-election in 2018. Nice guy. Wasn't initially for Trump. Eventually, he had to be for Trump. So Trump tells me, you know, when Dean Heller ran for re-election, he came to me and kissed my ass. And then, so I endorsed him. And then I would do rallies and people would hold up signs and he'd shout at me, sir, he's not for you. He's not for you. Well, it turns out I had talked to Dean Heller about how he ended up getting that Trump endorsement. And basically it was Donald Trump Jr. who played peacemaker. Donald Trump Jr. savvy enough to recognize that whatever his father thought of Dean Heller, Heller in 2018 was their best chance at holding a Senate seat since he was their only chance, because he was their only choice. So they had become buddies because they're both hunters. And like Donald Trump Jr. is like a legitimate like outdoorsman hunter. I joke he's the only real Republican in the Trump family. So he tells his father, he kind of smooths it over, and they still keep in touch. You know, they'll talk about hunting, stuff like that. But that's Donald Trump Jr. Like, here's this establishment sort of figure had criticized Trump in 2016. And Trump was nothing but trouble for Dean Heller because Nevada's Republican base is really supportive of Trump, but you have the Las Vegas suburbs and the Washoe County suburbs in northern Nevada, where, you know, Trump was just not good for Republicans in the suburbs in 2018. And so, but you couldn't like pick one or the other because they were so far apart, like it was hard to thread the needle. But at least Dean Heller got Trump not to like sink his campaign. But that's how valuable Donald Trump Jr. has become inside the Republican Party.
Everyone talks about Ron DeSantis. Trump doesn't run 4 years. See him in the Republican city decide to make a run.
Yeah, so he's become an interesting figure. You know, he's got as far as Republicans are concerned, he's got a really good record in terms of how he governed through the pandemic, in terms of how he balanced health concerns and economic concerns. And he's proven pretty good at playing the role of culture warrior. You know, he knows how to beat up on the media, which doesn't bother me. He knows how to beat up on Democrats. He knows how to beat up on big technology firms. He fights all of these cultural fights that Republicans want fought. And that has really served him well. And you've seen it in initial polling and name ID and being asked to headline these events. And he went out to Nevada for Laxalt's Basque Fry that he does every year. Laxalt's running for Senate in Nevada. You know, so he's all the way out there and he's busy raising a lot of money. DeSantis is going to have one major challenge if he runs for president. He's going to have to learn how to keep a team around him for more than 5 minutes. Now, look, voters don't care about consultants and strategists and teams. And they shouldn't, and I get that. But, Donald Trump is an anomaly. Not everybody comes to the table as a 100% well-known reality television star, with his various ability to control the news cycle. You're going to put together a national campaign or even a campaign in Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina, where all of a sudden, all the people you thought liked you are shooting at you because they're now supporting your Republican competitors. You need a team of loyal, talented people helping you navigate that. And constant turnover is not a good thing. And Governor DeSantis has constant turnover in his administration at the political level. So he's going to have to learn how to fix that. And if he can fix that, then, he could do well. I mean, look, he might do well anyway, but I think that that is a major vulnerability of his.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. We're all set with the Zoom link, if anyone. Oh, I'm just going to pass you the mic so everyone can hear.
So all this being said, where do the Democrats stand? And how would you evaluate the Biden presidency approximately 300 days into it?
Yeah, well, they've got their own problems. Look, the thing about presidencies is I never like to evaluate them too soon as though it's a final evaluation, because we've seen presidents go through huge midterm losses, major rebukes, then come back and win re-election. Now, look, I think that Joe Biden's biggest problem right now is that he was elected to be the adult in the room, to provide competent governance, to manage the pandemic. And the first thing that happened and it's important because you can make all sorts of mistakes. It's when you make the mistakes that you were elected not to make. The way he handled the Afghanistan withdrawal, I think, was a major hit, because here was a guy that maybe you wouldn't agree with everything he did, but he was going to do things properly and he was going to do things competently. And that was a major hit to his leadership. I don't know that Democrats recognize why that was a major problem. I think they focused on the fact that most Americans of all political stripes wanted the U.S. to withdraw from Afghanistan. That's true. If you notice, if you talk to Republicans, they'll say it's unconscionable we left Americans behind, and we left behind a country run by the Taliban, which is a threat to U.S. national security. So would you send back in American troops? Well, no, I wouldn't do that. So top line policy, Biden's fine, but the way he handled the withdrawal was a hit to his image because it went against why people elected him. The fact that Democrats are having trouble governing right now on Capitol Hill is another domino that's hurting his approval ratings, because right now it doesn't look like they can govern. I think a big mistake that he made, although I understand he has to deal with a party in Congress, and that's part of our system. He negotiates this bipartisan infrastructure bill, gets 17 Republican votes in the Senate. That's why people elected him. I mean, maybe not if you're progressive, and I understand that, but if you're an independent voter, soft Republican, even a soft Democrat, and now it's held hostage until they can get the partisan bill done. He could have passed that, and just like his American Rescue Plan, which Republicans screamed up and down was no good, but voters liked it. And they liked that he got something done on the pandemic right away. It showed action, it showed competence. So look, Biden's in right now a world of hurt, and his party's in a world of hurt. But I think they're headed towards losing control of Congress anyway, for no other reason than the margins are so thin. They don't have a Senate majority. They have the tiebreaker. They have a 5-seat House majority. That's not governable. That's not a governing majority. You control the agenda, you control the floor. You can't govern that way. So Republicans are probably going to win control of Congress, which could be the best thing that ever happened to Joe Biden. I mean, I think the worst thing that ever happened to Joe Biden is those Georgia Senate seats. Because if Republicans win those, or at least win one, they control the Senate. And then Biden can tell Nancy Pelosi and all the Democrats, although I think Pelosi would have been perfectly fine with this. Hey, man, what do you want me to do? I got to negotiate with Mitch McConnell. You see what our margins are? We only control one House of Congress, 5-seat majority. What do you want? But the minute they won control of Congress, and politicians always do this, they never look at the size of the majority. They say, we want it all. Everybody wants us to do everything we ever promised. And it's like, nope, you weren't the other guy. But particularly the margins. I mean, who looks at a 50-seat majority, quote unquote, and a 5-seat House majority and says, New Deal, next FDR? I mean, FDR is an icon. FDR had ginormous majorities, like huge. And even Barack Obama in 2009, you know, first the Democrats had 59 Senate seats, and then they had 60 after Arlen Specter switched, and they still struggled for Obamacare. And then they lost that special election in Massachusetts, and Scott Brown showed up, so they had to do a lot of it through this reconciliation process where you can, you know, skirt the filibuster. So you couldn't do healthcare, you could barely do healthcare reform with a 60-seat, 59-seat Senate majority and like 40 seats in the House. And you're trying to do all of this, but the progenitor for their problems was Afghanistan. And Biden is going to have to find a way to recover. Passing legislation and getting this part over with would help him. But look, this country has myriad challenges. He has a new opportunity every day to remind Americans what they thought they liked about him. Will he do that? I don't know. Will Democrats in Congress wake up and do things differently? Probably not, but like members of Congress never do things differently because they're always like this, especially House members. Senators are better. They get elected every 6 years. When you run statewide, it requires a little bit more political savvy and understanding that not every voter in your state likes you. But you come from, I don't think gerrymandering is a bad thing personally, but you come from these gerrymandered districts, left, right. And the only voters that matter are the people that like agree with you or think that you're moderate, even when you're not. So it's just a different ballgame. But yeah, they got their own issues.
Appreciation. So thank you.
Thanks, guys.